inside the chain-link fence of Camp Shelby, Mississippi in the humid spring of 1944, a small group of captured German generals watched American mechanics crawl under a heap of wrecked vehicles. The sun fell on burned-out Sherman tanks, their armor blackened by the last exchange of shells. Around them young Americans in sweat-stained uniforms, hammered, cut, and pried at twisted metal. From behind the wire, a general named Karl Heinz von Stollingagel turned to his fellow officer and smirked. "Soldiers," he muttered, "they look like garage workers." His companions laughed. Sharp and hollow, they had once commanded thousands of panzers that rolled across France, men trained in the cult of precision. To them, a man who fixed machines with bare hands belonged in a workshop, not on a battlefield. Yet what they saw through that fence was a portrait of a different kind of army. These American mechanics, barely 20 years old, moved with stubborn rhythm. They carried no medals, spoke little, and slept among their engines. They worked not for glory, but for the simple faith that everything broken could be made right again. That day the P camp buzzed with uneasy pride. Germans carried their arrogance like armor built over years of propaganda that taught them German intelligence was the pinnacle of civilization. Even defeat, they clung to it, mocking the oil-stained soldiers who refused to rest. One diary found years later captured the mood. They think they can fix anything, even fate itself. Outside, a hammer struck steel, echoing through the evening air. Inside, the laughter faded, leaving only the hum of insects and a strange growing curiosity. None of the generals yet knew that the same men they mocked would soon perform a feat that no lecture at Berlin's engineering had ever imagined. As the light dimmed and the Mississippi sky turned copper, the smell of diesel mixed with pine. Somewhere beyond the camp, the sound of distant engines hinted at America's endless reserves, factories working around the clock, rail lines carrying endless supplies. That night, arrogance still ruled the barracks, but history was already shifting. Pride, like steel, would soon bend under the pressure of sweat and belief. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And before we move on, tell us, where are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? The rain came without warning, pounding on the corrugated roofs of the repair yard. In the distance, a dozen Sherman tanks sat motionless, their tracks buried in the Mississippi mud. Hours earlier, they had arrived from a training ground near Hattiesburg, battered and broken after a live fire exercise. The German generals allowed short walk by their guards, paused to watch. One of them, General Wilhelm Biddish, smirked through the drizzle and said coldly, "By morning they will abandon them. That is what amateurs do." But as dusk fell, the Americans refused to leave. Floodlights snapped on, cutting white circles through the storm. The yard turned into a makeshift battlefield of sparks and shadows. Mechanics in soaked uniforms crawled under the hulks, removing twisted bolts. With bare hands, someone dragged a steel plate under a flickering lantern. Another man heated a damaged sprocket until it glowed, shaping it with the butt of a wrench. Private Joe Ramirez, 22-year-old from San Antonio, worked silently beside his sergeant, his hands trembling from fatigue. In his pocket was a folded letter from home. It read, "Your mother says you can fix anything, Joe, even our old radio. Maybe that's why the army needs you." Those words drove him through the night. Around him, the hiss of welding torches mixed with the rumble of thunder, each spark a defiance against failure. Inside the barracks, German officers watched through rain-streaked windows. They had been taught that machines were sacred objects born from calculation, not improvisation. The sight of men patching armor with tin from ration cans felt like blasphemy. Yet the Americans worked with a rhythm born not of discipline but of belief. By midnight, the camp wryer of oil and sweat, one of the mechanics, a corporal named Alan Fisher, coughed black smoke from his lungs and joked, "If we don't get her running, she'll think we gave up." The men laughed softly, a tired laugh that still carried pride. Germans tried to sleep, but the sound of hammers and grinding gears haunted their dreams. At 2:00 a.m., a truck arrived from a nearby depot, headlights cutting through the fog. Boxes marked ordnance supply were thrown into the mud. Inside, pistons, bearings, rubber seals, enough to breathe life into the dead. In one corner, Sergeant Lell took a deep breath, wiped the rain from his brow, and whispered, "No one's leaving till she moves." It was not a command, it was a promise. By 4:00 a.m., the storm eased, leaving behind silence and steam rising from the ground. The German generals slept fitfully, unaware that by dawn, the impossible would roll again. Before dawn, the air was thick with fog and the bitter scent of oil fires. The German generals rose early, drawn by the strange metallic symphony beyond the wire. From a distance they saw shapes moving through the mist, silhouettes of Americans working around campfires. Sparks shot upward like swarms of fireflies. The prisoners gathered the fence, their breath visible in the cold air. What they witnessed was chaos turned into creation. The Americans had built a workshop from nothing: metal drums for anvils, wooden planks for tables, rations tins for molds. They forged new parts in open flames, hammering with rifle butts, cutting steel with saw blades scavenged from wreckage. General Karl Heinz Fundel rubbed his eyes. "They're blacksmiths," he muttered. "In 1944, an army that fights with hammers." His tone carried both ridicule and confusion, but when one of the soldiers struck a heated gear into shape and it fit perfectly onto an axle, the general fell silent. One mechanic, Corporal Pfizer, had discovered that a torn fuel line could be replaced using the soft metal from a coffee can and wire stripped from a broken radio. It held. He grinned through the soot on his face, unaware that across the fence his ingenuity was dismantling years of ideology. The Germans whispered themselves, "Where are their engineers?" One asked, "Where are the specialists?" Another replied in disbelief, "They have none. They are all specialists." By 500 a.m., the Americans had managed to weld 3 drive shafts and reassemble a gear housing that had been declared unsalvageable. The camp's night guard, quiet sergeant from Kentucky, shook his head and said softly, "They're building the war back up from scratch." An old German officer named Erich Kruger couldn't help but watch. Once a professor of mechanical design at Dresden, he scribbled in his confiscated notebook, "They lack elegance, but they possess something else: urgency, faith, freedom from the fear of mistakes." As dawn's first light touched the horizon, the sound of hammering slowed. The mechanics, drenched and exhausted, leaned against their tanks, tools still in hand. Across the wire, silence fell. Von Stillagel broke it with a whisper. "If our men worked half as they do, the war might have ended differently." No one answered. The realization hung in the air, heavier than smoke. The myth of German superiority was cracking, not from defeat in combat, but from witnessing a kind of strength that no doctrine could replicate. That morning, the empire of precision met the democracy of improvisation, and for the first time the Germans began to understand that victory in this war was not about who built the perfect machine, but who never stopped trying to make it move again. The first light of morning crept across the camp like a slow tide, turning the soaked mud to bronze. Stillness settled, that fragile quiet before revelation. The American mechanic stood in a loose line beside the repaired tanks, faces smeared with soot, eyes hollow from the sleepless night. Behind them, faint steam rose from radiators and exhaust pipes that had not breathed for days. Then at 6:03 a.m., a hand signal flashed. A dozen men climbed into their Shermans. The air thickened with anticipation. One of the German generals, still half-dressed, hurried to the fence as the first engine coughed, sputtered, then roared. The sound ripped through the valley like thunder. Another tank followed, then another, and until the camp was filled with the pounding rhythm of reborn steel. Thick smoke coiled into the pale sky. Mud flew from the treads as the tanks began a move, one after another, forming a convoy that circled the yard. The ground shook beneath them. The Germans gripped the wire, speechless. Just hours earlier, they had laughed at the thought of American improvisation. Now they watched machines resurrected from ruin by men who had nothing but determination, light and stubborn faith, General Kruger stood motionless. They did not repair them, he murmured, they resurrected them. His words carried no irony now, only awe. Even von Stonagel, the proudest among them, lowered his head as the tanks rumbled past. For the first time he looked not at machines, but at men, ordinary soldiers who had defied impossibility with bare hands. One diary entry from that morning reads, "The engines began as whispers, then grew into a storm. We thought it was thunder, but it was the sound of their belief made real." A guard nearby smiled faintly and said to no one in particular, "They don't quit, not ever." As the convoy circled for the final test, sunlight struck the metal hulls, painting them gold. The spectacle was almost holy, fire, smoke, and movement, born from sheer human will. In that moment, even the defeated felt the pulse of something larger than war, a reminder that machines are only as strong as the hearts that build them. When the last engine fell silent, the Germans still stood there, unable to speak. Somewhere deep within them, something shifted, a small fracture in the wall of arrogance. They had witnessed the impossible, and it had the sound of an engine turning over. By mid-morning, the smoke had cleared and the yard fell into an almost sacred quiet. The German generals still stood by the fence, their boots sinking slightly in the wet ground. What they had seen at dawn left them restless, not just because the Americans had achieved the impossible, but because of what it revealed about two worlds colliding within the same century. The German creed had been perfection. In their factories back home, an engineer would reject a part if it was a fraction of a millimeter off. A worker who improvised was reprimanded, even punished. The American creed they were beginning to understand was different. Perfection mattered less than perseverance. What counted was motion, the refusal to stop. Sergeant Lell, his hands still trembling from fatigue, sat on a toolbox drinking lukewarm coffee. When asked how they'd done it, he shrugged and said, "You just keep fixing till it works, that's all." To him there was no philosophy, only practice. Yet to the Germans watching, it was philosophy incarnate, the triumph of flexibility over rigidity. General Kruger wrote in his confiscated notebook later that day, "They treat flaws as challenges, not as shame. Their imperfection is their strength." Those words, never intended for publication, would surface decades later in a military archive, a quiet confession from a man who had spent a lifetime worshipping flawless machines. Inside the camp mess hall, two prisoners argued softly. "They win because they build faster," one said bitterly. "No," replied another, "they win because they believe everything can be rebuilt." Even among the guards, a shift was visible. Corporal from Ohio remarked to a fellow soldier, "Those guys in the fence, they don't laugh much anymore, do they?" The other nodded. "Would you, after seeing your whole worldview turned inside out?" The moment became a living metaphor, two civilizations facing each other across barbed wire, not in hatred, but in revelation. Germany had forged its legend on the altar of precision. America forged its identity in the workshop of persistence. Viewers, what do you think defines strength, perfection, or resilience when everything falls apart? Would you rather have flawless plans or hands that refuse to quit? Share your thoughts below. As the sun set over the camp, the repaired Shermans were hauled onto trucks for redeployment, their grease-stained builders sat nearby, too tired to celebrate. But across the yard behind the wire, the German officers watched in silence, not with scorn this time, but with a quiet, unsettling respect. The following morning dawned clear and cold. The mist had lifted, leaving the camp washed in pale sunlight. From the barracks, the German officers heard it again, the low rumble of tank engines. Steady and rhythmic, they walked out in formation as if drawn by instinct and lined up along the fence. On the other side, the American Shermans were ready for departure, their armor still streaked with rain marks from the night's repair. The convoy began to move one after another. The tanks rolled past the wire, their treads clattering over gravel. Sound echoed across the valley like a slow heartbeat. The prisoners stood straight, silent, not a word, not a smirk, not even the shadow of mockery. remained for the first time since their capture. They stood as soldiers before soldiers. General von Stillagel removed his cap. The motion was almost imperceptible, yet it rippled through the ranks behind him. Even General Bittrich, once the loudest voice of derision, stood at attention. At Timasa, a single Sherman stopped near the gate. Its commander, Sergeant Lell, saluted briefly before the tank lurched forward. Again, the moment lasted only seconds, but it burned itself into memory. Inside the camp, an older prisoner whispered, "They have no uniforms of glory yet. They carry themselves like conquerors." Another replied, "No, like men who believe in what they do." At that instant, pride transformed into something else: admiration, even reverence. The same men who once mocked American mechanics for their dirt stained hands now felt a quiet envy for that simplicity of purpose. They had lived inside the architecture of hierarchy of orders and formulas, yet here in this open country far from Berlin, they were witnessing a different kind of power: the freedom to act, to fail, to try again until the engine turned. One of the guards later recalled the silence that followed the convoy's departure. It wasn't the silence of defeat, it was the silence you keep when you've seen something sacred that night. No laughter came from the German barracks. Instead, a strange peace settled in. Some of the men sat with folded hands, staring at nothing. Others wrote in their journals under dim light, their words hesitant but honest. As for General von Stolingagel, he walked to the fence once more, his fingers tracing the cold steel of the wire. He whispered to himself, "What they have no academy can teach. Do you watching now? Have you ever witnessed respect born from humiliation? Can defeat become a teacher when pride finally surrenders? Tell us below. Your thoughts might surprise someone who still believes that strength only wears medals." Years passed, the war ended, the camps emptied, and the laughter of those proud generals faded into the fog of memory. But some sounds never left them: the hammer's echo, the hiss of torches, the rumble of engines resurrected from ruin in retirement. Long after the Reich had crumbled, a few of those men began to write. Among them was General Erich Kruger, whose wartime notebooks would one day surface in a dusty archive near Munich. In one entry dated December 1946, he wrote, "We laughed because they were filthy, yet their dirt was honest, the kind that builds, not destroys." In another letter to former colleague, he confessed, "We were trained to command machines, they were trained to serve them. Perhaps that is why their machines obeyed and ours died with us." Admission was quiet, even sorrowful. It came not from defeat in battle, but from enlightenment born behind barbed wire. Historians later found that Kruger had never returned to teaching engineering. Instead, he volunteered at a post-war reconstruction plant near Hamburg, helping rebuild locomotives for civilian use. When asked why, he reportedly replied, "Because somewhere in Mississippi I saw what it means to fix things for the sake of life, not conquest." Another entry from von Stugel's unpublished memoir echoed that revelation. They fought with wrenches and faith. Their weapon was belief that anything broken, even a nation, could run again. Time softened the memory, but not the lesson. The sound of those repaired Sherman's roaring through the morning mist became a symbol of something greater than victory. It was a testament to will, the belief that resilience, not perfection, shapes history. Some nights old Kruger would dream of that yard, the sparks, the smell of oil, the young Americans laughing softly as they worked through the storm. In his dreams, the tanks still moved one by one into the light. When he woke, he would lie still for a long time, listening to the silence. Then he would whisper, "They won because they never stopped believing that nothing is beyond repair." And so what began as laughter in a prison camp ended as reverence in a man's heart, proof that sometimes the deepest victories are not measured in conquered land, but in changed minds. Long after the last tank was decommissioned and the last veteran buried, the story of that night in Camp Shelby still lingers, not in museums, not in textbooks, but in the memory of those who once thought they understood power. It reminds us that greatness is not born from perfection but from persistence, and that faith in action often outlives Faith in ideology, the German generals arrived in America believing they were prisoners of an inferior civilization, nation of amateurs, improvisers, workers. Without pedigree, what they encountered instead was a mirror that showed them what discipline without arrogance could achieve. They watched stunned as boys, with grease-stained hands and tired eyes, repaired not just steel but belief itself. In that transformation, the line between victor and vanquished blurred. America's strength during the war was never just in its weapons or its industry, it was in its ordinary people. Mechanics, welders, farmers, women in factory overalls who understood that effort itself was a form of courage. The hammer that struck metal in Mississippi was also striking at the heart of a myth that worth comes only from flawlessness. Years later, those same generals would describe that night as the moment they understood democracy not as chaos but as creative freedom, a place where mistakes were not punished but learned from, where failure was simply the start of another attempt. History often celebrates victories on maps, but the true triumphs happen quietly in workshops, in minds, in moments of humility. That night in the rain-soaked camp, a few broken tanks and a few unbreakable men revealed something eternal, that hope like steel can be reforged endlessly so long as hands are willing to